How much is your faith worth to you? I mean, what price would you pay? What if I told you in order to have a relationship with God, it's going to cost you some of your private bits? That's what we're talking about this week. If you want to get with me, it's going to cost you foreskin. Hello all, I'm the Mad Pastor, and Christianity sucks. It's boring, it's irrelevant, it's out of date, but it doesn't have to be. Let me explain why. Okay, so this week, let's just face it, we're going to read one of the most upsetting parts of the whole Bible, and it is the covenant that God makes with Abram, and he renames him Abraham and promises that he's going to be a great nation and kings will come from his lineage. But in order to accomplish that, Abram's going to have to give up something very precious, part of his man bits. And not only him, but every male to come out of him. Every male that is his child, every male that is his servant, every male that he acquires in any way, they're all going to have part of their penis cut off. And that's just, well, like I said, it's highly upsetting. So, we will be reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 17, and verses 1 through... And if you don't want to read it with me, you can use the little navigations below, and you can skip ahead if you would prefer. But for those of us who are hardcore, let's read the Bible. This is Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 14, and they sound like this. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will make you exceedingly numerous. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Okay, let's start with basic context. Remember, and I've said it before, if you haven't been watching, go check out my other Genesis videos. This book was written around 600 BCE. So even though it's talking about things that took place many, many centuries before, it's actually for an audience who is after the exile, after King David, after all of this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael, and after the covenant with Jacob, who becomes Israel. All of this stuff is written down after everything happens. So the writer has the benefit of foresight. So as the writer's talking about the covenant and predicting what's going to happen to Abram, who is now Abraham, the writer has the benefit of hindsight. The writer can look back into the actual history of Israel and say, oh, God said 2,000 years ago that this was going to happen, knowing full well that that's exactly what happened. So let's not read too much into the fortune telling. Let's just take it for what it is. This is written down for an audience who is exiled. Now, why might that matter? Well, an audience who has been conquered and exiled will need a reminder of who God is and the everlasting nature of God's covenant with anyone who is an Israelite, anyone who is a descendant of Father Abraham. It matters when you have been destroyed and completely taken out of your home and forced to live in a foreign land, and you feel distant from God. In that time, the message of, remember, we have an everlasting covenant that is sealed in our flesh. It is so permanent, it is a part of our very body. Remember that God is still with us and still faithful. That's the message behind the entire Torah, because it was written to a group of people who had been conquered and exiled from their homeland into a foreign land. Now, before we talk about the weirdness of circumcision and how that even became a thing, let's talk about some translation things. Why does God change the name of Abram to Abraham? Well, I'm glad you asked. Thank you for asking. The word Abram, the Ab part of Abram, means father. And that's the same thing in Abram and Abraham. So we've got two names that mean father. Abram, the ram part of that, means random access meant honored or lifted high. Ram means honored. Ab or Abe means father. So Abram's name literally means honored father. And then God changes that name to mean Abraham. And the Rahem part means of multitudes. So his name literally changes from honored father to father of multitudes. And this is an inkling of, an insight into the nature of God's covenant. God is going to make Abram, honored father, into the father of multitudes, an entire nation that will have a covenant with this God Yahweh, this new idea of God that actually cares about people and wants the people that follow him to have love and grace and forgiveness for others, and wants to be an example of what it means to have the kingdom of heaven on earth. That's the nature of this name change. So we've got multiple signs of this new covenant. God speaks the promise and then says, your name shall be changed, and then later also changes Sarai's name to Sarah. By the way, Sarai means quarrelsome, and then Sarah ends up meaning royal daughter, princess, lady. It's like a sign of royalty. So she goes from quarrelsome to royalty. That happens later. We're not going to read it, but you just take my word for it. So we've got this name change, and now to the real meat and potatoes of this whole thing, cutting off parts of your penis. That is a mark of the covenant. Let's get into it. So the first thing I want to say is that sounds outlandish, and that sounds like crazy behavior, but it's actually not that unusual. Many other cultures practice some version of circumcision. Egyptian culture, many other Arab cultures, Incans, Mayans, lots of people around this period in history all over the globe have ties to the practice of circumcision. And also, I would say, we still have practices in place today that are very similar to this idea. If you want to be part of this group, it's going to cost you something. We're going to tattoo you. We're going to brand you. The first thing that comes to my mind is gang culture. In order to be part of many gangs, you have to be jumped in. That means they're just basically going to beat the shit out of you, and you have to take it. And it's like, it's not that easy to get in. And, if you don't like the gang violent, the illegal version of it, then how about boot camp? and buds. Buds is the Navy SEALs train. It's gruesome. It's violent. It's horrible. And you have to endure it in order to be a member of that group. Lots of tribes today that are still active in South America and Africa still have practices around becoming a man, like rites of initiation. Some tribes, you have to jump off of a tall tower with vines tied to your feet. It's basically like a primitive bungee jump. And some people die doing it. Other tribes have practices where they literally cane you as hard as they can. And if you make a sound, then you don't get to be a man. Other tribes have practices where they go and slap a lion in the face, and you can't be a man in the tribe until you have done that. And of course, it has varying results. But you can see and hear this human tendency to initiate people into the tribe with something that costs something. And it's hard to imagine something that costs more than part of your penis. So it's not that unusual. It's a common human practice, and this is just kind of like the Hebrew version of that. Okay, next I want to talk about how do we even get to the specific act of circumcision? Well, it's probably rooted in sacrifice structures. It's rooted in the practices of trying to please the gods with bloodletting. I've talked about this more, and by all means, click in the whatever the things, take a look at the other videos. But probably what was happening is people started sacrifice culture because the letting of blood and death and decomposition actually led to crops growing better. And so because they were fertilizing the soil essentially with bloodletting, crops grew better. And so they began to take that to the next step and take that to the next step, and they iterate on that idea over and over again. And one of the practices that was very common in Incan, Mayan, Egyptian, and Arabic cultures was literally letting blood out of your penis. Because like what they saw was, when I let out blood, crops grow. So the gods must love me sacrificing something that's really important, like blood. And so they got more and more, and it eventually leads to literally letting blood out of your penis. Because is there anything more valuable to a man, especially a primitive man who wants children and wants to be valued in the tribe, than his penis? And so that began to take hold. That practice was like how to please the gods, to make crops grow and make harvest bountiful and make hunting reward us with meat, and like this was how to please the gods. And you can hear it. If you just keep following that logic down its natural end, you're going to end up with, well, let's cut off part of the penis. Let's cut off the foreskin. Maybe that will please the gods. I'm so devoted to you that I will cut this off. So this was probably a historical practice that was learned in Egypt from the Israelite people. And then, in hindsight, the writer of Genesis gave it meaning and attached it to the very important, true message that God is with you and there is something permanent about this covenant. So we circumcise as a sign of our faithfulness to God, and when we see that our penises are circumcised, we know that God is with us and has not abandoned us, even in this foreign city of Babylon. So now that we have extrapolated the historical context and the translational matters, let's talk about some interpretive matters. What does this really mean for us today? God does not require a flesh offering, and that's one of the most important developments of the New Testament and the modern Christian theology. Certainly that has been corrupted, and we can talk about offerings and the corruption within the church around offerings. It hasn't been executed perfectly, but let's talk about the original intent of this writer. This writer is essentially saying, God is faithful, and we have permanent signs to tell us that God will be for us even when things look bad. Being a part of this covenant, this relationship with this God, is a forever permanent thing. So when things look really bad, as they did in 600 BCE for the Israelites, you can have faith and remember for sure that this is a much longer history and that God is at work in bigger and often hard to understand, but larger ways that are ultimately for us. God is for you when you engage in this covenantal relationship. So, with that, may the Lord